The cold bit through the leather of his flight jacket, a familiar, almost comforting sting. Oberleutnant Erich Hartmann, at 22 years old, already wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves on his throat, the fabric of his collar worn thin by its weight. He sat in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G-6, engine idling with a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated up through the seat and into his bones. The airfield at Mizil, Romania, sprawled out before him in the pre-dawn gray of August 17, 1943. The smell of damp earth, high-octane fuel, and the faint, ever-present scent of burning from the distant front lines filled his nostrils. Through his headset crackled the voice of his wingman, Feldwebel Walter Krupinski. Another milk run, Jewel. Krupinski used Hartmann's squadron nickname, a reference to his girlfriend. His tone was light, bored. The Ivans are still sleeping off their vodka. Maybe we'll find a few lazy Radas to swat before breakfast. Hartmann allowed himself a thin smile, his breath fogging slightly in the cockpit's chill. He scanned the instrument panel, his eyes lingering on the kill markings painted just below the canopy rail. 149 small black tulips, each representing a Soviet aircraft destroyed. 149. The number was a physical presence, a testament to a truth he and every pilot in Jagdschwader 52 knew in their marrow. They were masters of this sky. The Soviet Lavochkins and Yaks were brave, sometimes fanatical, but they were crude machines flown by pilots whose training was measured in weeks, not years. Aerial combat here on the Eastern Front was a brutal calculus of experience, and the Germans held all the variables. "Just keep your eyes open, Kruppy," Hartmann replied, his voice calm. "Even a sleepy bear can have sharp claws." But he didn't believe it, not really. Today would be like yesterday and the day before that. A patrol along the Dnieper bend, maybe a quick, decisive schlag, a strike, against a scattered formation, adding another tulip or two to his collection. The Americans, he knew, were fighting far to the west, over Germany and France. Their war was one of giant bomber formations and high-altitude escorts, a conflict of industrial tonnage. Here, it was a duelist's war, and in a duel, Erich Hartmann had never met his equal. What he could not know, as he signaled to his ground crew and began to roll forward onto the grass strip, was that the calculus was about to change. The variables were being rewritten, not in a Berlin design bureau, but in a sprawling, deafening complex halfway across the world. And the first terrifying lines of this new equation were already being drawn in the high, thin air over the Romanian oil fields he was tasked with defending. The reports had been filed, of course. Vague, fragmented things from reconnaissance flights and nervous signals intelligence officers. They spoke of a new, massive American bomber, a four-engine giant with a defensive armament so heavy it was deemed impossible by Luftwaffe technical assessors. These reports had been circulated, debated briefly, and then largely shelved. The prevailing wisdom at the Luftwaffe's high command was clear. The Americans were masters of propaganda and production, not of aerial warfare. Their bombers were slow, vulnerable flying boxes. Their fighters lacked the range to be a true threat. It was a comforting narrative, built upon 2 years of undeniable success against the Western Allies in the air. It was also a narrative that was about to shatter with the force of high-explosive bombs. And the men of JG-52, the highest-scoring fighter wing in history, would be the first to witness its destruction. The confidence that bordered on arrogance in the Eastern Front fighter squadrons was not born of mere hubris. It was forged in the furnace of staggering, unprecedented success. By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, particularly on the Eastern Front, was a legion of aces. Men like Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, Gunther Rahl, and Walter Nowotny had tallies that seemed to belong to mythology, not military history. The Bf 109, in its various iterations from the Emil to the Gustav, was the instrument of this dominance. It was a known quantity, a razor-sharp extension of the pilot's will. Light, incredibly agile, and armed with a mix of machine guns and deadly accurate 20 cannons, it had cut through the skies of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia for 4 years. Intelligence assessments of the American air threat, when they bothered to look east, were dismissive. A February 1943 report from the Luftwaffe's own Technical Analysis Division, the Technisches Amt, concluded that the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, were structurally incapable of mounting a serious strategic bombing campaign against targets in Eastern Europe. The logic was seductive and, based on the data they chose to believe, seemingly sound. The report estimated U.S. heavy bomber production at a maximum of 300 units per month, an impressive number, to be sure, but one that would be diluted across the global theater. More importantly, it highlighted the bomber's Achilles heel: range. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the workhorse of the USAAF, had a combat radius of approximately 1,000 miles. To reach the vital oil refineries at Ploiesti, Romania, the very targets Hartmann was patrolling to protect, from bases in North Africa or Italy, would require a flight of over 1,200 miles, much of it over hostile territory. It was, the report stated with Teutonic certainty, a logistical and tactical impossibility. The bombers would either have to fly with minimal bomb loads and extra fuel, rendering the mission pointless, or they would risk running out of fuel and ditching in the Mediterranean or the Balkans. The idea of a fighter escort for such a distance was laughable. The American P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning were known to be short-legged, fuel hogs. This intelligence failure was compounded by a deeper, more insidious cultural bias. Within the halls of the Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium, Reich Air Ministry, there was a profound belief in qualitative over quantitative superiority. German engineering was the finest in the world. This was an article of faith. A single, brilliantly designed machine, operated by a knightly ace of unparalleled skill, could defeat a dozen crude, mass-produced vehicles. This ethos had been validated time and again on the Eastern Front, where the technical sophistication of the Bf-109 and later, the Focke-Wulf FW-190 routinely bested greater numbers of Soviet aircraft. The American approach, standardization, interchangeability, mass production, was seen as the antithesis of this warrior ideal. It was the method of a shopkeeper nation, not a martial one. A report from a German military attaché in Washington, D.C., intercepted and read with amusement in Berlin, quoted an American industrialist saying their goal was to make aircraft like Ford makes cars. The Luftwaffe generals chuckled. You could not build a knight's sword on an assembly line. There were, of course, faint voices of dissent. A few forward-thinking officers, like the brilliant but often ignored Oberstleutnant Hajo Hermann, had begun to study the patterns of American bombing raids over Germany itself. He noted a disturbing trend. The formations were getting larger, their defensive fire more coordinated and deadly. In a memo marked for immediate attention in May 1943, he warned that the USAAF was developing new tactics and possibly new aircraft that could fundamentally alter the strategic balance. His memo was acknowledged, then buried under more pressing concerns about the deteriorating situation at Kursk. The disconnect between the Eastern and Western air wars was nearly total. The veterans of JG-52, hunting yaks over the Kuban, had no frame of reference for what was beginning to happen over the Reich. And why would they? They were winning their war every single day. What none of these German assessments could fathom, what truly lay in the realm of the unimaginable, was the scale and ferocious ingenuity of the American industrial response. While German engineers tinkered with incremental improvements to existing designs, America had mobilized its vast resources not merely to match the Luftwaffe, but to overwhelm it through a combination of brute production numbers and revolutionary technological leaps. And at the heart of this effort, aimed like a dagger at the Reich's most vulnerable point, was a single, monstrous aircraft, the B-24 Liberator. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was not born from a desire for elegance. It was born from a desperate need for range, payload, and survivability. Its chief designer, David R. Davis, had conceived of a revolutionary high-aspect ratio wing, the Davis wing, that provided exceptional lift and fuel efficiency. Paired with four Pratt & Whitney RMS-1830 twin Wasp engines, the B-24 could fly higher, farther, and with a heavier load than its more famous cousin, the B-17. But its real secret, the feature that would make the Ploiesti raid possible, was not just in its airframe. It was in the factories that built it. The primary production facility was the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan, a colossus of industry that stretched over 67 acres. Under the relentless drive of Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, Willow Run became a machine for building machines. The assembly line, over a mile long, moved with a terrifying efficiency. The goal was not one plane a day, or even one per shift. The goal, stated plainly by Sorensen, was a bomber an hour, and they nearly achieved it. By August 1943, Willow Run was spitting out a completed, combat-ready B-24 every 63 minutes. In the time it took a German factory like Messerschmitt's Regensburg plant to painstakingly assemble 3 Bf-109s, America produced over 20 B-24s. The numbers were incomprehensible to the German mindset. 67 92 Liberators in 1943 alone. For context, the entire German Luftwaffe received only 61 46 fighters of all types that same year. The Liberators destined for Ploiesti were not stock models. They were part of a highly secretive project, modified for one of the longest, most daring bombing missions of the war. Designated Operation Tidal Wave, the plan called for a low-level, precision strike to avoid radar detection and flak. The aircraft were stripped of unnecessary weight, their bomb bays fitted with extra fuel tanks, giving them the miraculous range the Germans deemed impossible. Their defensive armament was a nightmare made real. Each B-24D model carried 1050 caliber Browning M12 machine guns in powered turrets and waist positions. 2 in the nose, 2 in a top turret, 2 in a tail turret, 2 in a retractable Sperry ball turret on the belly, and 2 in waist windows. This gave each bomber a spherical field of fire that could put out over 14,000 rounds per minute of heavy 50 caliber ammunition. A formation of these aircraft was not a group of targets. It was a flying porcupine of lead. The man tasked with leading this unprecedented mission was Colonel Keith K.K. Compton, a hard-nosed, aggressive commander of the 376th Bombardment Group. His second-in-command for the mission was the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker, a pilot revered by his men. They trained relentlessly in the Libyan desert, flying their heavily laden Liberators just 50 feet above the sand dunes, practicing the intricate, dangerous choreography of a mass low-level attack. The Americans knew the odds. They knew the German and Romanian defenses around Ploiesti, dubbed Festung Ploiesti, Fortress Ploiesti, were among the most concentrated in the world. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns of all calibers, barrage balloons, and of course, the seasoned fighters of the Luftwaffe. But they had a weapon their enemies had not accounted for, the sheer, shocking mass of their striking force. On paper, Operation Tidal Wave called for 178 B-24s from 5 bomb groups to take off, fly over 1,200 miles, navigate the treacherous Balkans, and strike multiple refineries simultaneously. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity. And as Erich Hartmann took off on his routine patrol that August morning, the first of those Liberators were already roaring down desert runways at Benghazi, their bomb bays filled not just with high explosives, but with the terrible, unanswerable arithmetic of American industrial might. The signs had been there for months, scattered like ominous breadcrumbs across the intelligence landscape of the Eastern Front, but no one had connected them into a coherent, terrifying picture. The first warnings came not from spies or code breakers, but from the pilots themselves, and they were systematically dismissed. In late June 1943, a lone Heinkel He-111 reconnaissance aircraft, on a routine patrol over the Mediterranean near the Italian coast, was intercepted and badly damaged by what the pilot described in his after-action report as a formation of very large, four-engine bombers with twin tails, possessing exceptional speed for their size. He estimated their cruising speed at nearly 300 mph, far faster than any known Allied heavy bomber. The report was forwarded to Luftwaffe 4 headquarters in Romania, where a staff officer, reviewing known Allied aircraft, concluded the pilot had mistaken the silhouette of a B-17 for something new. The report was stamped bestätigt, confirmed, as a B-17 sighting and filed away. The distinctive twin tail of the Liberator was not yet a recognized threat indicator. More concrete evidence arrived in early July. A Romanian signals interception unit, monitoring Allied radio traffic from North Africa, picked up repeated references to low-level training and desert navigation exercises in messages between what appeared to be USAAF bomber groups. The intercepts mentioned coordinates that, when plotted on a map, formed a rough corridor pointing directly toward the Balkans. The Romanian intelligence chief, Colonel Eugen Christescu, personally sent a summary to his German liaison officer, Major Werner Schäfer, with a handwritten note. Increased activity suggests possible long-range operations. Recommend increased readiness in Ploiesti sector. Schäfer, a career officer more concerned with partisan activity than strategic bombing, reviewed the note. The Americans had never struck Romania. The distance was prohibitive. He scribbled "Übertrieben," exaggerated in the margin, and passed it to a subordinate for further analysis. It joined a growing pile of low-priority alerts. Then came the meteorological oddity. In the first week of August, weather stations in Greece and Bulgaria reported an unusual number of high-altitude contrails moving on a southeasterly track, far more than could be accounted for by normal Mediterranean air traffic. A junior Luftwaffe meteorologist in Athens, intrigued by the pattern, cross-referenced the data with wind charts and suggested the contrails could originate from aircraft flying from North Africa toward the Black Sea. His superior, an older officer who remembered the static front lines of the last war, scoffed. "Contrails are not an intelligence product," he was told. "Stick to forecasting rain." Perhaps the most poignant warning came from within the fighter corps itself. Hauptmann Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, a respected ace with over 150 victories, was temporarily transferred from the Western Front to the East for a staff liaison role in late July. Over drinks with pilots from JG-52, he listened to their confident boasts about the easy hunting against the Soviets. Then he spoke, his voice low and serious. "It's different in the West," he said. "The Americans, they come in waves, hundreds of them. Their bombers are tough and their fighters are learning. They have a new one, the Thunderbolt. It's a beast in a dive. Don't underestimate them." The Eastern Front pilots nodded politely, but their eyes held a glint of pity. Poor Mackie, they thought. The constant strain of defending the Reich against those endless formations had worn him down, made him cautious. Here, they were the hunters. The Americans were a problem for the flak gunners and the Reichsverteidigung, defense of the Reich units, not for them. This collective psychology of denial was a fortress as formidable as any around Ploiesti. To accept the validity of these scattered reports would be to accept that the war had fundamentally changed, that the sanctuary of distance was gone, that the enemy possessed capabilities that negated years of tactical doctrine. It was easier, far easier, to believe the pilots were mistaken, the intelligence was flawed, the contrails were a trick of the light. The alternative was a truth too disruptive to contemplate. So the warnings accumulated in filing cabinets, and the fighter groups like JG-52 continued their daily patrols. their vigilance attuned to the known threat from the east, their backs turned to the gathering storm in the south. The morning of August 17, 1943, dawned clear and hot over the Romanian plains. At 7 o'clock hours local time, Erich Hartmann and his swarm of 4 Bf-109s were cruising at 18,000 feet, the sun a hard, brilliant coin in the eastern sky. The patrol had been quiet, a few distant specks that resolved into a flock of storks, the lazy shimmer of heat rising from the Danube. Boredom was the enemy now. Krupinski's voice came through the headset again, a lazy drawl. Maybe we should land and find some real breakfast, Jewel. My stomach is arguing with me. Hartmann was about to reply when a faint, almost imperceptible vibration began to thrum through his airframe. It was not the sound of his own engine. It was a deeper, heavier resonance felt more than heard, a bass note trembling in the atmosphere. He frowned, scanning his instruments. Everything was normal. Then from the ground control station at Mizzle, a confused, static-laced transmission broke the radio silence. Achtung, Gelbschwarm, unidentifiziert Kontakt, Süd-Südwest, Sayer Niedrig, Sayer Veal. Attention, Yellow Flight, unidentified contacts, South-Southwest, very low, very many. Hartmann's head snapped to the southwest. At first he saw nothing but the hazy horizon. Very low, that made no sense for bombers. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw them. Not specks in the sky, but a dark, crawling mass just above the tree line, like a swarm of metallic locusts skimming the earth. They were so low they were kicking up dust and churning the air behind them into a brownish haze. The deep thrumming was their collective engine noise, a rolling thunder carried on the wind. Mein Gott, Krupinski breathed over the radio, all boredom vanished. Hartmann's mind raced, trying to process the scale. There weren't dozens. There were hundreds. A solid, seemingly endless stream of large, twin-tailed aircraft, flying in tight, disciplined formations of three-plane VS. They were not heading for the front lines. They were flying deep into Romania on a direct course that could only mean one target, Ploiesti. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The impossible reports, the dismissed warnings, they were all true, and they were all catastrophically, fatally late. Control, confirm heading of contacts, Hartmann barked into his microphone. The response was frantic. Heading 035, altitude less than 100 meters. Speed estimated 280 kilometers per hour. They are under the radar, unter dem radar. A low-level attack. It was insane. It was brilliant. It bypassed every layer of high-altitude defense they had. Hartmann's training, his entire combat experience, screamed at the tactical picture. His Bf-109G-6 was a high-altitude interceptor, designed to dive on bombers from above. Attacking at treetop level against a formation this dense was a recipe for disaster. The air would be churned to chaos, the risk of collision immense, and the defensive fire from those bombers. He could now see the multiple gun blisters dotting their fuselages. Each one was a lethal threat, but he was a fighter pilot and the enemy was in his sky. Gelbschwarm, folgen mir. Yellow Flight, follow me. He shoved the throttle forward, the DB-605 engine roaring in response, and began a shallow, screaming dive toward the approaching armada. As he descended, the scale of the American force truly revealed itself. The lead formations were already past his position, their shadows racing across the fields and villages below. More and more kept coming from the southwest, a relentless river of aluminum and firepower. He tried to count, gave up after 30. It was futile. He picked a target, a liberator on the edge of a formation. The standard attack profile was a high-side pass, raking the bomber from nose to tail. But at this altitude there was no high side. He was level with them, coming in almost flat. At 800 meters he could see the details. The olive-drab paint, the individual panels, the gunners in their turrets already tracking him. At 500 meters, he thumbed the trigger for his 20 MG 151 cannon. In that same instant, the world dissolved into fire. It was not the muzzle flash of his own guns he saw first. It was a sudden, terrifying constellation of orange flashes that erupted from the entire formation. Not just from his target, but from the bombers ahead, behind, and beside it. The Americans were firing a coordinated barrage, a wall of 50 caliber tracers that filled the air with glowing lines of death. The sound was a continuous, ripping canvas tear, overwhelming the roar of engines. Hartman instinctively jerked his stick, his 109 shuddering as he broke left. Tracers zipped past his canopy, so close he could feel their heat. He caught a glimpse of Krupinski's aircraft, also braking hard, a stream of fire from a B-24's top turret stitching a line across his wing. Then he was past, his speed carrying him through the formation and out the other side, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pulled into a climbing turn, looking back. The sight was apocalyptic. The sky behind him was a madhouse of twisting aircraft, crisscrossing tracer fire, and blooming black puffs of flak as the ground defenses finally woke up. One of the B-24s, hit by multiple sources, was trailing a plume of thick, black smoke, but it held formation with a stubborn determination he'd never seen in Soviet aircraft. Another had a wing sheared off by a direct cannon hit from a 109 and cartwheeled into the ground in a massive fireball. But the German fighters were paying a horrific price. He saw a Bf-109 fly directly into the concentrated fire of 3 Liberators and simply disintegrate. Another, trying to make a head-on pass, was met with a solid wall of fire from the nose guns of an entire formation and fell away, a shattered wreck. The radio was a cacophony of panic and rage. "Sie sind wie ein fliegendes Schlachtschiff. They're like a flying battleship. I can't get through the fire. Walter, break right, break right." A scream, then a burst of static. Hartman lined up for another pass, his mouth dry. This time, he tried from the rear, aiming for the tail of a straggler. The B-24's tail turret tracked him perfectly, twin streams of tracers converging on his cockpit. He fired a short, desperate burst and broke away, his windscreen starred by a near miss. The Liberator flew on, seemingly unfazed. He climbed again, seeking altitude, needing a moment to think. The tactical situation was worse than he could have ever dreamed. The bombers were not just numerous, they were incredibly well-armed and tenacious. Their low altitude negated the 109's best advantage, the diving attack, and they just kept coming. As he gained height, he saw the trailing end of the American stream, and behind it another wave. Not bombers this time. Squinting against the sun, he saw them. Sleek razor-winged shapes climbing hard from the southwest. They were still distant, but their profile was unmistakable. Twin booms, a central nacelle. P-38 Lightnings. Escort fighters, here, over Romania. The intelligence had been wrong about that too. They had the range. A new, colder dread seeped into his veins. The bombers were bad enough. The arrival of long-range American fighters changed everything. The Luftwaffe's mastery of this airspace, a fact as certain as sunrise for the past 2 years, was being violently contested in the span of minutes. He keyed his radio, his voice tight. "Control, this is Gelbschwarm leader. Enemy bomber force estimated at over 150 aircraft. Type B-24 attacking Ploiesti at treetop level. They have escort. Repeat, they have fighter escort. We are engaged. Losses are heavy. Request all available squadrons scramble immediately." The response was a moment of dead air, then a stunned, "Verstanden." Understood. Hartman looked down at the ongoing inferno. The lead American formations were now reaching the outskirts of Ploiesti itself. From his vantage point, he could see the first geysers of smoke and flame erupting from the sprawling refinery complex as the bombs began to fall. The deep crump of explosions rolled up through the atmosphere. The sky was darkening with a colossal, spreading pall of black smoke from burning oil. He had 149 victories. He was one of the best fighter pilots in the world. But as he watched the P-38s growing larger in the distance, their twin engines glinting in the sun, and looked back at the relentless, fire-spitting stream of liberators, Erich Hartmann felt a terrifying, novel sensation. It was the feeling of being obsolete, of facing not just an enemy but a new kind of warfare, a warfare of overwhelming mass, unimaginable range, and industrial fury that no amount of individual skill could counter. He took a deep breath, the smell of cordite and burning oil now reaching him even at altitude. He had a job to do. He pushed the stick forward, his 109 nosing down toward the climbing P-38s. Maybe he could break up the fighters before they reached the bombers. Maybe he could still make a difference. As he dove, the sun behind him, he saw the lead Lightning pilot spot him. The American aircraft banked smoothly, its wingman following in perfect unison. They didn't break formation. They didn't scatter. They turned into his attack, their 450 caliber machine guns and single 20 cannon in the nose already tracking him. There was a cold, professional confidence in that maneuver that was utterly different from the desperate, individualistic moves of the Soviet pilots he was used to. Hartmann centered his pipper on the lead P-38's cockpit, his finger tightening on the trigger. At that moment, a frantic, distorted shout erupted from his radio, cutting through all other traffic. It was a voice from the ground controller, shrill with panic. Gelbschwarm leader, abort engagement, disengage immediately. Hartmann's focus fractured for a critical second. Why? They were committed. The enemy was here. The controller's next words were swallowed by static, but the few that made it through turned the blood in his veins to ice. Radar reports, massive second wave, bearing 210, estimate over 200 additional. He never heard the rest. The world exploded in a blizzard of shattered plexiglass and screaming metal. A hammer blow struck the left side of his cockpit. The control column went dead in his hands. The roaring engine note choked into a sickening, grinding whine. Through the spider-webbed remains of his canopy, he saw the spinning, burning refinery complex of Ploiesti, the endless stream of bombers, and the cold, approaching shape of the P-38 that had just fired. His last coherent thought, as the centrifugal force pinned him to his seat, and the 109 began its final, uncontrollable spiral toward the burning earth, was not of his 149 victories, or his Knight's Cross, or his home. It was a single, searing question. The same question every German and Romanian defender of Ploiesti was asking in that moment of cataclysm. A question for which they had no answer. A question that heralded the end of their aerial supremacy. Where in God's name are they all coming from? The hammer blow was not a single impact but a series of them. A rapid, brutal drumbeat against the thin aluminum skin of his Messerschmitt. 350 caliber slugs from the P-38's nose-mounted battery struck in a tight group. The first shattered the armored glass of his canopy, sending a spiderweb of cracks across his vision and filling the cockpit with a hurricane of screaming wind and glittering fragments. The second tore through the instrument panel in a shower of sparks and hydraulic fluid, the glass of the altimeter and airspeed indicator exploding outward. The third, most devastating, ripped into the left side of the cockpit, smashing the throttle quadrant and searing across his left thigh. The pain was a white-hot lance, immediate and shocking. The control column was dead, the linkages severed. The DB-605 engine, its supercharger damaged, emitted a horrific, rising shriek before ceasing entirely. The sudden silence, broken only by the roar of the wind, was more terrifying than the gunfire. The Bf-109G-6, work number 16,324, was no longer an aircraft. It was a 2-ton piece of shrapnel, tumbling out of control. Centrifugal force slammed Hartmann against the left side of the cockpit, his injured leg screaming in protest. The world outside the shattered canopy was a chaotic kaleidoscope. A flash of blue sky, a whirl of green earth, the monstrous black pillar of smoke from Ploiesti, then sky again. He fought against the G-forces, his vision tunneling, his training screaming at him. Jettison canopy, release harness, get out. His right hand, moving with agonizing slowness, found the red-painted lever between his knees. He pulled. Nothing happened. The mechanism was jammed, bent by the impact. He hammered at it with his fist, a desperate, futile gesture. The ground was spinning up to meet him. He could see individual trees, a patchwork of fields, growing larger with each rotation. A strange calm descended, cutting through the pain and panic. So this is how it ends, he thought. Not in a duel with a worthy Soviet ace, but swatted from the sky by an American he never saw coming. A casualty of a war he didn't even know was being fought in his skies. The irony was bitter and complete. The knight's cross with oak leaves felt absurdly heavy around his neck, a medal for a war that had just been rendered obsolete. At perhaps 500 meters, the 109's death spiral intersected with the trailing edge of the smoke plume from the burning refineries. The world went dark brown, then black. Soot and choking chemical fumes filled the cockpit. He was blind, suffocating, trapped in a dying machine. This was it. He stopped fighting. He thought of his mother's face, of his girlfriend Ursula, Jewel, whose name was painted on his aircraft. The images were fleeting, washed away by the roar of the wind and the certain approach of the ground. Then, a violent, wrenching jerk. The aircraft had struck something. Not the ground, something in the air. A cable, a telegraph wire. The impact was sideways, shearing off the left wingtip with a metallic shriek. The asymmetric drag altered the spin, flattening it slightly, transforming the violent rotation into a steeper, more direct dive. It was still fatal, but it changed the angle. The ground was no longer a spinning blur but a defined, onrushing patch of cultivated land on the outskirts of Ploiesti, a field of sunflowers, their brown, heavy heads all turned away from the burning city. He closed his eyes. The impact drove consciousness from him with the force of a sledgehammer. There was no sound, only a profound, all-encompassing compression, as if the universe had folded in on his body. Then, nothing. He returned to the world through a symphony of pain. A deep, throbbing agony in his leg. A sharp, stabbing sensation in his ribs with every attempted breath. A warm trickle of blood down the side of his face from a gash on his forehead. He was upside down, suspended by his harness straps. The smell was overwhelming. Acrid smoke, spilled aviation fuel, rich Romanian earth, and the sweet, coppery scent of his own blood. He opened his eyes. The world was inverted. Through the mangled remains of the canopy, he saw the blackened stalks of sunflowers, their faces pressed against the torn earth. His aircraft had plowed a 30-meter furrow through the field before coming to rest, nose down, tail high, like a discarded toy. The engine was buried. The fuselage was cracked and broken behind the cockpit. Miraculously, it had not caught fire. Moving sent fresh bolts of pain through his body, but he was alive. The jammed canopy had been torn away in the crash. With fumbling, clumsy fingers, he released his harness buckle and fell in a heap onto the crushed roof of the cockpit, then tumbled out onto the churned soil. He lay there for a long moment, gasping, staring up at the sky. The sky that had been his kingdom, his realm of certainty, was now a scene from a different planet. It was dominated by the colossal, roiling black thunderhead of smoke from the burning Astra Romana, Concordia Vega, and Standard petrol refineries. Through gaps in the smoke, he could see the endless, streaming formations of B-24s, still coming like a migration of mechanical dragons. The deep, resonant thunder of their engines was a constant, oppressive drone. Higher up, the contrails of dogfights scribbled frantic white scars across the blue. The sharp, distant cracks of cannon fire and the deeper whump of bombs continued to roll across the fields. He saw a B-24, one wing a sheet of flame, slowly roll over and plunge into the ground a kilometer away, erupting in a silent, orange flower from his perspective. A moment later, the sound and shockwave reached him, a dull thud that vibrated in his chest. A shadow passed over him. He flinched, expecting strafing. But it was a Bf-109 trailing smoke, its pilot fighting for control. It wobbled low over the field, barely clearing the trees at the far end before disappearing from view. He did not see it crash. He hoped it made it. The scale of the defeat, the totality of the intelligence and tactical failure, settled over him more heavily than the pain. They had been not just surprised, but obliterated in their own backyard. The question echoed in his pounding skull, now with a new, horrifying clarity. Where in God's name are they all coming from? It was no longer a cry of battlefield shock, but the core of a strategic revelation. They were coming from a nation that could build aircraft like his opponents built tanks, or rifles, or boots. A nation that could lose dozens of these monstrous bombers and still have hundreds more to send. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. He tried to stand. His left leg buckled, the flight suit soaked with blood from thigh to calf. Using a torn piece of aluminum from his wreck as a crutch, he hauled himself upright. He needed to get away from the wreck. The Americans might strafe it, or worse, a fuel tank might still ignite. He hobbled towards a line of trees at the edge of the field, each step an exercise in agony. As he moved, he passed the shattered remains of his cockpit. His map case, his sidearm, were gone, buried, or thrown clear. But something glinted in the dirt. He bent, wincing, and picked it up. It was the knight's cross with oak leaves, the ribbon torn, the metal smeared with dirt and a streak of his blood. He stared at it for a long moment, then shoved it into the pocket of his flight jacket. Its weight felt different now. Not a badge of honor, but a relic. From the cover of the trees, he watched the end of the battle. The last of the B-24s passed over, their bomb bays empty, turning wearily southward for the long, perilous flight home. The P-38s, their escort duty done, circled high above like hawks, daring any remaining German fighters to challenge them. Few did. The air, which had been a maelstrom of noise and violence, gradually began to still, leaving only the crackle of the immense fires at Ploiesti and the distant wail of sirens. By mid-afternoon, a Romanian army truck, filled with soldiers and civilian firefighters, bounced down a dirt road near his field. He limped out, waving his arms. They were shocked to find a German ace, the famous Black Devil of the Ukraine, wounded and alone in a sunflower field. They loaded him into the back of the truck, already carrying other wounded, a Romanian flak gunner with a bandaged head, two burned German airmen from a downed He-111 that had been caught on the ground. No one spoke. The faces were blank with shock, smeared with soot and exhaustion. The truck joined a stream of other emergency vehicles, all heading toward the inferno that was Ploiesti. What he saw from that truck bed would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. It was not a battlefield. It was the aftermath of an industrial execution. The refinery complex was a vision of hell. Towering cracking units, twisted like melted candles, belched flames hundreds of meters into the sky. Storage tanks had been ripped open, their contents forming rivers of fire that flowed through the streets and into the surrounding fields. The air was unbreathable, thick with oily smoke, and the stench of burned chemicals and flesh. Firefighters and soldiers moved like ghosts in the shimmering heat, their efforts pathetic against the monumental destruction. Buildings were skeletal ruins. Railroad sidings were tangled knots of melted and overturned tanker cars. The precise, low-level attack had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had not just damaged the refineries, it had eviscerated them. At a makeshift field hospital set up in a schoolhouse on the city's outskirts, a harried Romanian doctor stitched his head wound and bandaged his leg. "The bone is not broken, but the muscle damage is severe," the doctor said in broken German, not looking him in the eye. "You are lucky." Hartman said nothing. Luck felt like a foreign concept. He was given a shot of morphine, and the world softened at the edges. Lying on a cot, listening to the moans of other wounded men and the ceaseless roar of the fires, he heard the first fragmented reports crackle from a radio in the corner. The voice was a Luftwaffe communications officer, his tone strained, reporting to higher command. The numbers were staggering, unbelievable. Initial assessment of Operation Tidal Wave. Enemy losses confirmed at 54 B-24 Liberators destroyed. A further 55 damaged, many seen crashing in Bulgaria, Turkey, Mediterranean, German and Romanian fighter losses, estimated at 24 aircraft destroyed. 11 damaged, flak losses minimal due to low-altitude approach refinery output at Ploiesti. Preliminary estimate is a reduction of 40%. Astra Romana refinery is 90% destroyed. The American losses were horrifying, over a quarter of their force. It was a tactical victory for the defenders on paper, but the voice on the radio did not sound victorious. It sounded hollow, because the broadcast then shifted to the broader picture, information being fed from other theaters, from intelligence sources suddenly scrambling to reassess everything they thought they knew. Simultaneous to the Ploiesti raid, USAAF 8th Air Force launched a dual-pronged attack of unprecedented scale against Regensburg and Schweinfurt in Germany. Over 376 B-17 bombers penetrated deep into Reich airspace. Schweinfurt ball bearing works heavily damaged. Luftwaffe Reichsverteidigung units claim 60 bombers destroyed. But losses, our losses are. The voice trailed off into static. It didn't matter. Hartmann understood. While he had been patrolling the quiet Eastern Front, believing the Americans a distant, irrelevant threat, they had been planning not one, but two knockout punches on the same day. One against the fuel that powered the German war machine, another against the machinery that built it. And they had the aircraft, the crews, and the sheer audacity to attempt both at once. The scale of the planning, the coordination, the industrial output it implied was mind-numbing. That night, as the morphine wore off and the pain returned, a staff car arrived from Mizzle. A young lieutenant from JG-52's headquarters, his face pale, helped Hartmann into the passenger seat. The drive back to the airfield was conducted in silence. When they arrived, just before dawn on August 18th, the atmosphere was funereal. The morning light revealed the cost. The grass field at Mizzle, usually bustling with activity, was eerily quiet. Of the 24 Bf-109s of III/JG-52 that had scrambled in frantic waves to meet the threat, only 11 were present. Many of those bore scars. Patched holes, missing panels, dark stains of oil and hydraulic fluid. Ground crews moved slowly, listlessly. The pilots who had returned stood in small, silent groups, smoking, their eyes hollow. The confidence, the arrogant swagger of the day before was utterly gone. It had been incinerated over Ploiesti. Hartmann's wingman, Walter Krupinski, found him. "Jewel," he said, his voice rough. He had a bandage on his forearm and a cut on his cheek. "We thought you were gone. They saw your crash." "I was lucky," Hartmann repeated the doctor's words, the phrase tasting like ash. Krupinski shook his head, his eyes wide with a look Hartmann had never seen in him before, not fear of death but fear of irrelevance. "It was a slaughter, Erich. Not for them, for us. We dove in and it was like flying into a hailstorm made of lead. They weren't just shooting back. The entire sky was full of tracers. Fischer, he just vanished. A direct hit in the cockpit. Schulz tried a head-on pass against a formation leader. His aircraft came apart. It wasn't combat. It was industrial." The Gruppenkommandeur, Major Dietrich Hrabeck, called a briefing in the operations hut. The maps on the wall were outdated, still showing Soviet front lines. Hrabeck, a veteran with a calm demeanor, looked aged. He confirmed the radio reports. JG-52 had lost 13 aircraft and 9 pilots in less than an hour of combat. 7 more pilots were wounded. It was the single most costly day in the Jesuiters' history, a history that included the brutal fighting over Stalingrad and Kuban. "The Americans call it the Liberator," Hrabeck said, tapping a grainy reconnaissance photo of a B-24 that had been circulated months ago and ignored. "Its defensive firepower is equivalent to that of 20 of our fighters firing simultaneously. Our tactics are obsolete against such formations at low altitude. The High Command is reassessing." A pilot in the back, a young Oberfeldwebel with 3 victories, spoke up, his voice trembling with anger. Reassessing. What is there to reassess? We cannot fight them like this. We need heavier armament, more armor. Hrabeck fixed him with a weary gaze. The FW-190 Ammonus 6 with 2 additional 20 cannons is in production. It will be months before they reach us here. The new Bf-109 G-6 with the 30 Mk-108 motor cannon is also coming. But I must be frank with you all. The technical office has examined wreckage from a Liberator shot down over Italy. The simplicity of its construction. It is designed to be built by the tens of thousands, not by master craftsmen. They are not building the best aircraft in the world. They are building enough of the aircraft that is good enough. The words hung in the smoky room. It was the unthinkable admission. Quality had met quantity, and quantity on that day had won. The shockwaves of August 17, 1943, did not remain confined to the scorched fields of Romania. They radiated outwards, a seismic event in the strategic consciousness of the Axis, revealing cracks in the foundation that would soon become chasms. In the weeks and months that followed, similar moments of terrifying revelation occurred across the globe, each one a variation on the same theme. The overwhelming, industrialized might of the United States was now fully brought to bear, and it was a force for which the Axis had no answer. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, a parallel disillusionment was taking place. Lieutenant Commander Keiichi Arima, a veteran pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy's elite 201st Air Group, climbed into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi AM-50 at Rabaul on April 7, 1944. He was part of a massive counterattack against an American carrier task force reported east of New Guinea. The Zero, the symbol of Japanese aerial invincibility in 1941 and 1942, was light, nimble, and possessed of an incredible range. Arima, like Hartmann, was an ace, with 27 confirmed victories. He believed in the spiritual superiority of the Japanese warrior, the Yamato Damasha, which could overcome material disadvantage. The American force they encountered was Task Force 58, the fast carrier spearhead of the U.S. Navy. The sky was filled with a new American fighter, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. It did not possess the Zero's mystical maneuverability. It was heavier, tougher, faster in a dive, and carried 650 caliber machine guns with ample ammunition. The American pilots, their training now rigorous and standardized, did not seek the elegant, turning dogfight the Zero excelled at. They used disciplined, two-plane teams, diving from altitude with devastating energy, making a single, slashing pass, and climbing away before the lighter Zeros could react. Arima watched in horror as the elegant, fluid formations of his comrades disintegrated under the Hellcat's onslaught. His own Zero, caught in a crossfire between two F-6Fs, shuddered as 50 caliber rounds shredded his wings and set his fuel tanks ablaze. As he bilayed out over the open ocean, his aircraft a flaming comet, he saw the scale of the American fleet below. A dozen carriers, surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, a floating city of war-making power. The Japanese strike force of 120 aircraft was annihilated. They claimed 20 American aircraft shot down. In reality, the U.S. lost 10. It was a massacre with a kill ratio of 12-1. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For men like Arima, pulled from the water to become a prisoner of war, it was the end of a doctrine. The Zero, the soul of Japanese naval air power, was now a death trap. The Hellcat, produced at a rate of over 500 per month at Grumman's Bethpage plant, was simply the better tool for the new, brutal arithmetic of the Pacific War. Back in Europe, the perspective from the German High Command was one of gathering panic masked by furious activity. In the Wolf's Lair, East Prussia, Adolf Hitler received the Ploiesti damage reports on August 19th. He flew into a rage, not at the Americans but at the Luftwaffe. "The Luftwaffe is a failure," he screamed at a cowed Hermann Göring. A single raid and 40% of our oil from Romania is gone. Where were our fighters? Where was the foresight? Goering, the once-proud Reichsmarschall, could only offer promises of new wonder weapons. The Me-262 jet, the Arado 234 bomber. But Hitler's fury was rooted in a dawning, terrifying comprehension. The war of production, which he believed Germany could win through the exploitation of conquered Europe, was being lost in a landslide. A secret memorandum from Albert Speer's armaments ministry, circulated only to the innermost circle on September 1, 1943, laid it bare. The combined output of the United States in aircraft, tanks, and trucks for the month of July 1943, it stated, exceeds the total German production for the entire first half of 1943. The disparity is no longer linear, it is exponential. Each month, the material gap widens by a factor we cannot hope to match, even with total mobilization. The men tasked with closing this gap, the engineers and technicians, viewed the problem with a mixture of professional admiration and despair. At the Luftwaffe's Richlin Test Center, a team led by Professor Ernst Heinkel examined the wreckage of a B-24 Liberator that had crash-landed in Denmark. Their report, marked Geheim Kommandantschaft Top Secret, was a technical obituary for German qualitative superiority. The aircraft is of remarkably simple and robust construction, it noted. The use of stamped parts, standardized fittings, and extensive subassembly is evident. It is designed for mass production by semi-skilled labor. Its defensive armament, while not sophisticated, is devastatingly effective due to its concentration of fire. The Pratt & Whitney engines, while less powerful individually than our DB603, are extraordinarily reliable and fuel-efficient. The aircraft's true secret is not a single technological marvel, but the optimization of every component for volume manufacture and ease of maintenance. We estimate the man-hours required to produce one Liberator at approximately 18,000. A Heinkel He-177 requires over 65,000. One engineer, a veteran of designing the exquisite curves of the He-111, was said to have run his hand over a riveted section of the Liberator's wing and muttered, "We have been building Stradivarius violins. They are building hammers, and they have enough hammers to smash every violin in the world." For the common soldier and junior officer, the evidence was more visceral. Lieutenant Hans Müller, a panzer commander in the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, witnessed it during the bitter fighting in Normandy in June 1944. His Tiger tank, a masterpiece of engineering that could destroy any Allied tank at long range, was immobilized by a thrown track after a skirmish. As his crew worked desperately under sporadic artillery fire to repair it, they watched the sky. From dawn to dusk, it was owned by the Allies. Waves of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, the jugs the intelligence reports had once dismissed as short-ranged fuel hogs, now roamed with impunity, thanks to disposable drop tanks. They were not just fighter escorts, they were fighter bombers, each capable of carrying 2 1,000-pound bombs or a fearsome load of rockets. Müller watched a flight of 4 P-47s spot a German half-track column trying to move through a hedgerow lane. The aircraft circled once like birds of prey, then dove. The rockets streaked out with a sound like tearing cloth. The subsequent explosions walked precisely down the lane, obliterating vehicles and men. The Thunderbolts then circled back, their .850 caliber machine guns hosing the wreckage. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. No German flak had fired a shot. No German fighter had risen to challenge them. As the P-47s climbed away, their radial engines throbbing, Müller looked at his magnificent, immobilized Tiger. It was a museum piece, a knight in plate armor, rendered immobile by a swarm of archers who could shoot from a mile away. The Thunderbolt, he learned later, was so rugged that it could survive damage that would shatter a Bf-109, and was being produced at a rate of 1 every 3 hours at Republic's Farmingdale factory. The Allies didn't need a tank as good as a Tiger. They had 10 Shermans, and the air power to ensure those Shermans could get close enough to fire. The most profound psychological shift occurred among the prisoners of war. As the Allied strategic bombing campaign intensified in 1944, thousands of German aircrew found themselves parachuting into captivity in England and later, the United States. For Oberfeldwebel Karl-Heinz Merten, a radio operator on a Ju-88 night fighter shot down over Bremen in September 1944, the journey to a POW camp in the American Midwest was a revelation that shattered the last remnants of Nazi propaganda. Shipped across the Atlantic on a Liberty ship, another product of America's staggering production, built in an average of 42 days, he was then loaded onto a train. The train passed through the industrial heartland of America. For hour after hour, Merton and his fellow prisoners stared out the barred windows at a landscape of power that defied imagination. They saw steel mills that dwarfed anything in the Ruhr, their skies glowing orange day and night. They passed the Chrysler plant in Detroit where Sherman tanks rolled off a line in a continuous stream. And then, near Ypsilanti, Michigan, they saw it, the Willow Run plant. The sheer size of it made men gasp. It was not a factory. It was a geographical feature. B-24 Liberators in various stages of assembly dotted the landscape like seeds sown by a giant. Completed bombers, painted in olive drab, sat in rows that stretched to the horizon, waiting for ferry pilots to fly them to war. One prisoner, a former engineer from Messerschmitt, began to weep silently. He did the math in his head, comparing the frantic, dispersed, bomb-harried production of German aircraft to this serene, colossal output. "We are finished," he said to no one in particular. "We have been finished for a long time, we just didn't know it." Merton, in a letter home smuggled via the Red Cross, wrote, "They do not have factories. They have cathedrals dedicated to building machines of war. The scale is not of this world. We were told we were fighting against Bolshevism and plutocrats. We are not. We are fighting against geography, against physics, against the very idea of limits." The strategic impact of this industrial and technological tsunami was total and irreversible. The control of the air, once contested, became a permanent Allied possession. With it came the ability to interdict German movement at will, as seen in the transportation plan before D-Day, which systematically destroyed French railways and bridges. It allowed for close air support that turned battles like the Falaise Pocket into massacres. It forced the Luftwaffe into a defensive, reactive posture, bleeding it white. In 1943, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 10,000 aircraft. In 1944, that number would soar to over 25,000. The loss of experienced pilots was even more catastrophic. Men like Hartmann were irreplaceable. A new pilot arriving at JG-52 in late 1944 had, on average, less than 50 hours of total flight time before being thrown against the vast formations of American bombers and their veteran escorts. The average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe pilot on the Western Front in 1944 was measured in weeks, sometimes sorties. The collapse of morale was not a sudden break, but a steady erosion, like a cliff face crumbling into the sea. Veterans who had survived hundreds of missions against the Soviets began to exhibit a fatalistic recklessness, or a careful, self-preserving caution. Both were symptoms of a broken spirit. Missions were no longer flown to achieve victory, but to satisfy a desperate command structure or to protect one's comrades for one more day. The belief in final victory, the cornerstone of Nazi ideology, evaporated, replaced by a grim determination to survive or to die well. For Erich Hartmann, the war continued for another 20 months after that day in the sunflower field. His leg healed, though it would ache in cold weather for the rest of his life. He returned to flying, his skill undiminished. He continued to score victories, his tally climbing to an astronomical, never-to-be-surpassed 352 confirmed kills. But the nature of the war had changed. The easy dominance over the Eastern Front was gone. The Soviets were now fielding superior aircraft in vast numbers. The Yakmanis III, the Laminis 7, and the shadow of the Western Allies was always present. The skies were no longer a German lake, but a contested, deadly space where technological parity and overwhelming numbers had leveled the playing field. He witnessed the final, futile attempts to adapt. He flew the Bf-109,000, the last variant, a fine aircraft but still fundamentally the same design from 1935, now outclassed. He heard the rumors of the Me-262 jet, saw a few, knew they were revolutionary, but also knew there were no fuel for them, no trained pilots in sufficient numbers, and that Allied bombers were systematically destroying the factories that made them. The wonder weapons were not a salvation. They were a postscript, a glimpse of a future Germany would not be allowed to have. On May 8, 1945, Oberstleutnant Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace in history, surrendered his JG-52 to the advancing U.S. 90th Infantry Division at the Czechoslovakian town of České Budějovice. He made sure his men destroyed their remaining aircraft, a final, bitter order. As he handed over his pistol, the American lieutenant who took it, a young man who looked like he should still be in college, glanced at the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds that Hartmann still wore. The American's eyes showed not hatred but a kind of awed curiosity. "You must have seen a lot of action," the lieutenant said. Hartmann, his face gaunt, his eyes older than his 23 years, looked past the American at the green, peaceful Bohemian countryside. He thought of the burning sky over Ploiesti, the endless stream of liberators, the question that had haunted him since that day. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet, "I saw the future, and it was not ours." He was shipped to a POW camp and later handed over to the Soviets, who would imprison him for 10 brutal years. In the grim solitude of the Soviet gulags, he had ample time to reflect. The memory that returned most often was not of his greatest victory, but of his most profound defeat. The moment in the spinning cockpit, watching the P-30 its guns flash, and the desperate, unanswered question about the origin of the endless armada. He eventually understood the answer. They came from the boundless plains of Michigan, from the shipyards of California, from the drafting tables of engineers who thought in terms of thousands, not prototypes. They came from a nation that had chosen, with relentless, focused purpose, to build not just an air force, but an air industry. The duelists' war was over. The war of the assembly line had been won before the first bullet was fired on August 17, 1943. All that followed was the terrible, inevitable working out of the equation, an equation written not in tactics or bravery, but in steel, aluminum, and the limitless capacity of a mobilized democracy. The final, devastating statistic of that war of production stood as the ultimate epitaph for the Luftwaffe's defeat. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States produced 324,750 military aircraft. Germany, in that same period, produced 85,000. The duel was never between pilots. It was between factories. And on that day over Ploiesti, Erich Hartmann, the greatest duelist of them all, had simply met the factory.